Hey guys, Bartel's Bookshelf here with my latest reading update. I've got 4 books for you here, which is cool. Most of them are pretty short, quick reads, but still, January's been off to a pretty good start. With the book that I just finished, I think that's 6 books so far this month that I've completed, so I'm pretty happy about that. Hopefully, it maintains that same pace for the rest of the year. We'll see. But it's been kind of stressful. I know a lot of stuff going on. Haven't been sleeping great, so I might be a little tired and rambly in this. I apologize. Try to keep things short as well because I ramble so damn much. But anyway, first off, I read "They Told Me I Was Everything" by Gregory Ashe. This is a gay romance novel, first in a series. This is the first quarto. I've actually borrowed this. This was a recommendation from Nakia, who she read the whole series and really liked it. And this year I've been trying to read more like friend suggestions and stuff. In fact, most of what I have here are suggestions from friends. So yeah, I read this. This is about a young man named Augie who's in his first year of high school, and he ends up meeting. He's kind of looking for a new start and stuff. He's not really out of the closet, and he's a social. He's started growing a social media following. And that kind of forces him further into the closet because he's worried about sort of ruining his sort of the perception that people have of him, and of people turning on him because of his sexuality and stuff. And also Theo, who is a professor, a grad student, according to the back of this. He turns out to be his college professor in a class he has on Shakespeare. And they end up having an encounter where Augie almost crashes into Theo in a car accident, and Theo is recovering from a car accident that killed his husband and his daughter. And so there's a lot of sort of trauma going around from that. And they end up they start off kind of on uncertain terms, not sort of hateful of each other, but just very sort of distrustful. And then they end up getting pulled together, not just because of their class, but because a mysterious video surfaces of someone who apparently has been murdered, and the last person that saw them was Augie. And so the book kind of follows 2 tracks: the murder mystery, or figuring out the mystery of figuring out what happened to the guy who disappeared in the video, and of sort of the burgeoning relationship between Theo and Augie. So yes, this is a teacher-student romance, although that aspect of it isn't focused on very much because Augie only has Theo's class for about a semester, and they don't start a relationship until after that, so that's kind of how they sneak by some of that controversy. But I thought this was actually really, really good. You can kind of tell from the overall vibe of the cover. It's very sort of angsty, very sad, dealing with lots of different forms of trauma, through Augie and Theo's various, experiences. There's a lot of stuff about Theo's recovery from this car accident that, killed, these people in his life that he cared so much about, and sort of how do you start anew after something world-ending like that. Dealing with sort of the aches and pains in his leg, his physical therapy, all that kind of stuff. And sort of the heart of the relationship is about sort of their own various insecurities and how they come to each other. They're sort of forced together through these sort of inauspicious circumstances, and then they slowly get to actually know one another and get to like each other. I can be pretty picky with romance novels, but I enjoyed this. As I say, it pretty effectively sidesteps a lot of sort of the creepy sort of power imbalances you might get in a book like this. Not that that necessarily bothers me. I'm not, when it comes to literature. I'm not really I don't try not to bring sort of my own sense of morality to it, especially for a romance novel where it's all about the fantasy and stuff like that. But it kind of sidesteps a lot of that stuff, and it's more about sort of, as I say, their trauma and how they sort of navigate these things together amidst all of the other stuff that's going on. I thought the mystery was really intriguing. And it leaves a few threads hanging that Nakia explained to me get explored in the later books. Augie and Theo are really cute together. It's only about a 10-year age difference, so it's not a massive, sort of age gap. I've read, much larger ones. There is some conflict in the fact that, Theo is a lot older, and, there's sort of that period of adjustment of sort of what are you kids talking about type thing. And I thought it balanced things well between, sort of full-on, dark, depressing angst and, excitement and humor. Augie and Theo, they're very sort of humorous people, even though they're going through a lot. They're very sarcastic, as you might expect an English professor and, a young influencer to be. And a lot of that banter between them is really endearing and cute. The emotional ride that they go on, I think, is very believable and very well represented, very well executed. normally like I hate it in like books like this when a lot of the conflict feels very manufactured, where someone just so happens to hear just enough of a conversation that it sounds like they're saying something bad, or that type of thing, or it's like this would be so easily solved if two people would just talk to each other, and there isn't any of that. The conflict feels very real, very earned. It doesn't feel like the author is kind of moving the pawns around too much. And as I say, I think it was a good balance between, sort of the darker, angstier stuff and the lighter, humorous stuff, and how they kind of find comfort in each other and stuff like that. Obviously, as I say, there's a lot of things left hanging from this, particularly a lot of stuff about the relationship between some of the... Theo's husband was a cop, and so they're kind of using a lot of those connections throughout the book to investigate this mystery that's going on. And there's a lot of stuff involving Theo's husband's partner on the force, Carter, or Cart for short, and sort of the higher ups in the police force and stuff that are kind of left hanging, but. Nakia told me, they get explored more in the sequels, so I'm definitely looking forward to reading more of these. I thought the writing was pretty good. It's very crisp and clean, but it's not overly showy, which is nice. Reading books like these, sometimes the writing can kind of suffer a bit. I just thought this was a really enjoyable, sort of angsty gay romance. Dark enough to be sort of emotionally involving, but not depressing, good banter, the mystery was interesting, the characters were fun, and there were some reveals that were genuinely shocking that I genuinely didn't see coming, and that were very satisfying to sort of encounter. Definitely want to read more of that. As soon as Nakia can find the rest of them in her collection somewhere. So yeah, there you go. This is another suggested book. This is Ant Farm by Simon Rich. Ant Farm and Other Desperate Situations. This is recommended by another friend of mine who I met at my D&D group. She mentioned really enjoying this when she was in high school, and it was very, very short. It's only about 139 pages, so I figured I would give it a shot. And yeah, it's cute. I honestly don't have a whole lot to say about this one, so I won't focus too much on it, but it's basically a collection of short, humorous like scenarios. Like, for example, the ride back to Beersheba is the first one, which is like a dialogue between, with Isaac and Abraham, after, Abraham stopped sacrificing Isaac, and sort of the awkward conversation of don't tell your mom about this when we get home, There's like if life were like middle school, I can only think of two scenarios where high school math would come in handy. Stuff about like sex ed, people trying to communicate with a Ouija board that's like trying to tell people to help solve his murder and stuff like that. So as you can see, they're very, very short, little bite-sized sort of mini like comedy sketch, like sketch ideas, like I hesitate to call them little essays, but it sort of reminded me of some of the articles you would read on like crack.com back in the day, where they would have sort of made up scenarios and then little dialogues based on those scenarios, It's pretty entertaining. The humor is very... I actually looked it up, and these were originally published in the National Lampoon. In fact, I think Simon Rich, was the former Harvard Lampoon president. So a lot of them, it's that very dry sort of Harvard Lampoon sort of college humor type thing. So it's cute. I didn't think it was incredible or anything. It's just like I say, it was just a short little humorous piece that I needed something sort of light and short to read during sort of the post-Christmas malaise. So I just read through this, and it was nice. I especially enjoyed the dog X-Files, mostly because I just finished binging X-Files last year. Where the dogs are like, tell us what happened. I used to go into the living room every day. I'd run around, scratch up the couches, have a good time. Then yesterday I went inside, and all of a sudden a horrible electric shock shot through my entire body. Unbelievable. Did you try going in again today? Yes, the same thing happened. I don't even want to go into that room anymore. Wow, I have no explanation. Stuff like that. It's very silly, very dry, very much like sort of here's a funny scenario type thing. I enjoyed it. As I say, I don't know if it was amazing. I don't know if it really will leave me with a whole lot, but it was it was good to sort of pad out the reading material. So yeah, that was fun. And then sorry, this is a big book here. I've read These Fists Break Bricks: How Kung Fu Movies Swept America and Changed the World by Grady, Hendrix, and Chris Poggiali. So I have to find a way I can hold this. So I've been getting really over the last month or so. I've really been getting back hardcore into like martial arts flicks, kung fu stuff, Hong Kong, all that kind of stuff. Especially the old Hong Kong stuff. Like I've watched, I think, over 30 movies now, martial arts movies, action movies, and with a real heavy focus on the classic Hong Kong period, 70s, 80s, 90s. And I found out about this recently, which is basically Grady. It's Grady Hendrix of Paperbacks from Hell fame, but writing about kung fu films. Because I learned recently that's actually kind of his other passion. He actually used to write a lot of film reviews back in the day, focusing on a lot of kung fu and martial arts stuff. In fact, he actually wrote a review of The Raid 2 when that first came out. And more recently, he's actually on the special features for a Criterion channel segment about Ringo Lam, the Hong Kong director who just made stuff like City on Fire. So I didn't know that, but yeah, he's very, very into this stuff, very knowledgeable about it, and this is basically just an exploration, as it says, of the kung fu craze of America. So with that comes like some very specific sort of caveats. So if you're going into this book looking for sort of a detailed history of kung fu movies in general, sort of the history of like the studios that started them and the sort of the cultural zeitgeists that like led to the different trends and things, this isn't really about that. This is very specifically focused on kung fu in America. So how it came over in 1973, really exploded onto the scene with Five Fingers of Death, aka King Boxer. And then, of course, you had, the Bruce Lee explosion with Enter the Dragon, and then his untimely death, which led to all the Bruce-sploitation stuff. And it goes a lot into sort of the history of the different theaters that showed these places, how they influenced a lot of things in American culture. You can see there's a foreword here by the RZA from Wu-Tang Clan. So it focuses a little bit on that, and just sort of that overall kind of culture, the culture of the kung fu craze that led to all these different things. Like it goes into the way that these movies were imported into America, the way they were edited, the different trends that went around. Like like there's a whole section on Bruce-sploitation. They talk about Chan-sploitation, all the different ripoffs, and it even goes into sort of how. The first sort of explosion, a little bit of the history of Eastern martial arts in America. In the first sort of chunk of it, it talks a lot about like judo, how judo was like the big thing, and then you had like jiu-jitsu and aikido, and then eventually kung fu, and how during World War II a lot of these things were sort of like looked down upon because they were like Eastern treachery and stuff like that. But there's like stuff here like old hand-to-hand combat manuals and things like that, and sort of the first explosion of different sort of like American martial arts masters in America. And it even goes into a lot of one of the things that I found most interesting about it, that of course I was aware of because of the history of like RZA and Wu-Tang and all that stuff. I knew kung fu movies had a huge influence on black culture and stuff, but this goes pretty heavy into that, talking about black and Latino culture. Here's a thing from Jet Magazine about a ghetto karate school, all kinds of stuff about the sort of the how it sort of provided an escape for a lot of black youths, black and Latino youths, gave them something to kind of aspire to, that kind of thing, and it goes really heavily into a lot of black martial artists and stuff. Like the big one, Moses Powell, Steve Muhammad, and there's the first logo of the Black Karate Federation, So it really goes into the first quarter of this, I would say, is just all about kind of or not the first quarter, but the first little section is like, all about like the history of martial arts, of Eastern martial arts in America, and then we go into the 70s. And as you can see, I mean, this book is just incredibly well put together. It's beautiful, glossy pages and all these reproductions of old posters and things. There's Five Fingers of Death there, a.k.a. King Boxer. It goes through a lot of the different, as I say, it goes through a lot of the different trends in martial arts. How you had, Bruce Lee was kind of the king, and then everybody was trying to be Bruce Lee for a while, and then Jackie Chan came out and kind of loosened things up, made things more humorous, and then they were trying to, make everything about Jackie Chan. It goes a little bit into sort of the different trends like kickboxing and things like that. And it does talk a lot about the history of kung fu movies themselves, like how, see how they were retitled, from, the Big Boss to the Chinese Connection and stuff like that with Bruce Lee. Talks a lot about Bruce Lee, obviously, because you can't really not talk about kung fu without talking about Bruce Lee. But I learned about a lot of other people that I'm just now discovering for the first time, like Angela Mao and stuff like Lady Whirlwind and stuff like that. Or what was the other one? David Chang and T Lung, who I just learned about, who were in a bunch of movies together in the '70s for Shaw Brothers. But as I say, it's not really specifically about kind of the history of the actual like studios, the actors. It's more about sort of kung fu as like a cultural phenomenon. Like it does talk about the actors. Like here's a bit about Jimmy Wong Yu, but it's more about sort of that whole cultural zeitgeist and how changing tides, cultural, economical things, led to the downfall of a lot of these old, theaters that would screen these things. But it goes into a lot of different things. So they even have like little interstitial bits like these, that go into certain aspects. Like this is about, ninjas and stuff like that, and like karate and like kung fu ads and like comic book magazines and stuff. There's actually a whole section here. Well, I mentioned there's a whole section on Bruceploitation, where they had all these actors with names that sounded similar to Bruce Lee and looked kind of like Bruce Lee, how they tried to kind of make follow-ups to his movies and rip-offs and stuff. But there's actually even something here, the Bruce Directory, which is literally just profiles of a bunch of the most prominent Bruceploitation stars. And each one, gets a little write-up, with like... Judy Lee, who was credited as Bruce Lee's sister and stuff like that, and she was in stuff like Kung Fu Exorcist and Queen Boxer and that type of thing. It's very, very detailed, and I really, really enjoyed it. And as I say, one of the things that I enjoyed the most about it was learning a lot about black martial artists that I wasn't aware of. Like, I knew about, obviously a lot of the big ones like, Jim Kelly, Ron Van Cleef. I've even learned recently through all of these watches of people like Eugene Thomas, who was in a bunch of low budget, like Robert Ty stuff. He was great, Steve James. But I learned about a lot of other, black martial artists that I'd never heard of, that appeared in a few movies, like, James Iglehart and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff. It's the sort of thing where it's like, if you're into this kind of stuff and you don't come away with a huge list of movies that you want to watch after this, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. But it's loaded with stuff, somewhat to its detriment, I would say, because as I say, certain things like don't really get a lot of focus. You can see like the 80s is a very, very short, it spends most of its time on the 70s, obviously, because you got to talk about Bruce Lee and that first explosion. But comparatively, it doesn't spend a ton of time on the 80s. And the ninja really gets short shrift. There's really only one little section about ninjas, which I know isn't exactly kung fu, but ninjas show up in kung fu movies all the time. But they do talk about, the ninja explosion with, like, the Octagon and Enter the Ninja and all that stuff. But it doesn't focus a lot on sort of the 80s, like, Golden Harvest era, with, like, Sammo Hung, Jackie Chan, Yuen Biu, people like that, which I thought was a little disappointing. But again, I mean, as I say, this is focused very specifically on kung fu films in America, in the West, and sort of, and so really, unless you were going to a lot of these specialty theaters who were showing a lot of these movies, a lot of the sort of 80s, sort of Jackie Chan, D&B, Sammo Hung type stuff, wasn't really like available to a lot of Westerners at the time. But I would have liked a little bit more of an emphasis on some of that, even if it's not exactly kung fu at that point, and it's more largely, more broadly into the action genre. I would have liked a little more about that. But as I say, I mean, this is just a really exciting, just fascinating book. I mean, it's loaded with pictures and posters and, like, lobby cards and newspaper clippings and things like that. There's even a whole section here, like I see, like, there's even a whole section here, Creepy Fu, about, like, kung fu and horror, so... It's messy, but I think that kind of works, in some level, because, it's like... It's just kind of throwing everything at you, But at the same time, it can be a little sort of the pacing can feel a little bit weird, and it can't like cover everything that I would like it to cover. There's some stuff for King Kung Fu. But as they say at the end of the book, it is just an introduction. It's just meant to kind of get you into this whole world. yeah, there's a whole thing at the end about the last dragon and Timok, who was the star of that, and how his career kind of fizzled out. A lot of really really interesting information. So, if you're into this stuff. And you really, and you don't come away with like all kinds of things that you want to watch, like we're just on a different level, I think. I came away with a lot of, new things that I want to watch. In fact, I just watched this the other night, The Heroic Trio, with Anita Mui, Maggie Cheung, and Michelle Yeoh. That was crazy. That was a lot of fun. That was like a superhero movie mixed with like Evil Dead or something. It was really entertaining. But yeah, so it's just a lot of fun. It's just a great little thrill ride through sort of the history of kung fu movies. And it's not, as I say, it's not just, Hong Kong stuff, kung fu. They talk about some ninja movies, and they even talk about some Japanese stuff like the Street Fighter series with Sonny Chiba. So it's just a really good, solid overview of kung fu. I think if you were interested in kind of the history of kung fu and sort of where to start, I think this would give you a pretty decent jumping off point, at least. So yeah, I really really enjoyed that, and I'm actually going. Just serendipity. I'm actually going tomorrow to see John Woo's Hard Boiled in movie theaters because I just found out it's getting a re-release, and tomorrow's the final day. Like a few of his movies are actually being re-released this year, which I just found out about. I know The Killer is coming out in March, and A Better Tomorrow is coming out in April. So I'm definitely going to go see those. So it was just serendipity. My hyper focus happened to line up with all this with all these events, which I'm very very happy about. And yeah, I'm still enjoying my martial arts stuff. I'm sort of losing a bit of focus from Hong Kong. I've been doing a lot of Hong Kong, a lot of Jackie Chan. I watched all of Bruce Lee's movies. Tons of stuff. A lot of 80s, as I say, a lot of 80s Sammo Hung, Yuen Bu stuff, Dragons Forever, Righting Wrongs, that type of thing. And I've been showing these to my friends, and I hope they've been enjoying them. But yeah, like I just watched The Raid 2 last night. I loved it. But yeah, I could go on, sorry. But the point is, like, it's just great. A great little resource, just like Paperbacks from Hell. It's a great little exploration of a specific time in American history, and I think if you're a Kung Fu fan, you really owe it to yourself to check this out, so yeah. And finally, I actually just finished this. This is The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. This is another recommendation from my friend at the D&D group who also recommended Ant Farm. She read this about a month or two ago, and it sounded interesting, so I thought I would check it out. And yeah, this was pretty enjoyable. So yeah, this is about a woman named Kara, who's just recently divorced from her husband, and she's moved back in with her uncle, who runs this museum that he calls the Wonder Museum, which is basically a museum for a bunch of weird, like, curios, oddities, and knickknacks. Fur-bearing trout, weird taxidermy, a sunflower portrait of His Holiness the Pope, and she ends up, sort of staying there while she tries to get back on her feet and sort of figure out what to do with her life and stuff. And one day she finds a hole in the wall that seems to lead to this alternate dimension full of these bunkers and these mysterious willows that seem to sort of insidiously work their way into everything. So yeah, if you couldn't tell from that, this is essentially a retelling of Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, which she cops to at the end in the author's note, which I enjoyed what she said, H.P. Lovecraft wrote that The Willows by Algernon Blackwood was one of the most terrifying stories ever written. Before I read it, I assumed that this probably meant some people in it weren't white, and I began it, preparing to roll my eyes a bit. But The Willows is a genuinely disquieting story, for all the occasional excesses of the prose. Some lines stick with you. The frontier of another world, an alien world, a world tenanted by willows only and the souls of willows. So this was her sort of reinterpretation of that story. And I thought this was great. I thought it was really, really creepy. She's friends with this guy named Simon, who's, sort of a 30-something, gay guy who wears, makeup, eyeliner, and wears a top hat and fishnets. He looks like a goth, Mad Hatter. And they're really good friends, and he's really, like, sardonic and snarky, and he ends up getting pulled into the other world with her for a little while. And they end up sort of going through this hellish landscape together, and that whole sequence was one of my favorite points in the book, where her and Simon are just kind of stuck together in this alternate world and need to figure out how to get back. And it's almost like this, much like the original story of The Willows, it's this, like, insane travelogue where, they encounter all of these, like, eldritch, universe, reality-defying beings, and there's some really, really horrifying imagery in here. Surreal, disquieting, gory imagery that was a lot of fun. But the thing that surprised me the most about it because I went into this expecting it to be kind of a straightforward horror novel, and actually it's a little bit different than that. It's actually, in a weird sort of way, it's kind of cozy. Because it's written in that sort of very sardonic, sarcastic, millennial humor style, where Kara is kind of constantly trying to diffuse situations with humor. And Simon, of course, is very snarky, typical sort of gay best friend vibes. But he's interesting. He's not just like a stereotype. And that threw me a little bit at first. It took some adjusting. But in a weird sort of way, I think it sort of contrasted well with the horror, where, a lot of the time, especially, as I say, among us millennials, we tend to undercut a lot of awkward situations through humor, and this is basically just kind of the ultimate version of that. But then there's some things that happen in the latter half of the story that really surprised me, and it goes in a direction that I didn't expect, and somehow throughout all of that, it kind of maintains that sense of like coziness and humor while still being like really creepy and scary. In fact, there's some really tense sequences in this, not only in the sequence where they're going through this whole world, but in some of the later sequences afterward. I don't want to spoil too much, but there's some stuff that happens toward the end that I thought was really unexpected and really kind of beautiful. And when kind of taken as a whole, it almost turns it into this fairy tale-esque kind of story, that I just thought was it really appealed to me. And of course, the Wonder Museum is just such a great place for a horror story. This like weird, a sort of off-kilter place. It feels like the kind of place where there would be a hole to the world in it. There's that atmosphere is put to good use, as I say later on in the story, with some things that happen. Again, no spoilers, but. I was surprised how much I enjoyed this. I've never read any of T. Kingfisher's stuff before. I know she wrote this book, The Twisted Ones, and she's written some fantasy and things like that. I've seen her books around everywhere. Never read them before, but this was a lot of fun. I was surprised how much I enjoyed this. And I liked that she didn't over-explain everything, where everything came from, what it was going on, because that really wouldn't be true to the spirit of the story, and of that whole kind of weird horror vibe. My only real sort of criticism is I do think the humor does undercut the horror a lot. And this is more just a personal preference, but to me it's very hard to pull off that style of humor, that sort of like Marvel-esque style where people are constantly pointing out that something weird is happening, like he's right behind me, isn't there? Or that just happened. It's not as bad as that. I want to make that clear. It's not as bad as that. But there is an element of that to it, of that sort of like millennial humor sort of undercutting, the seriousness of situations. That can be a little off-putting if you're not sort of prepared for it. It didn't bother me too much, and it's such an integral part of the character and sort of her coping mechanism that it eventually just sort of comes off that way, like a coping mechanism. And when things are serious, like, they pretty much stay serious. It's just, but I think that's why people kind of label this as a cozy horror, because it's not necessarily, like, it's interesting because it's all this bleak, like, reality-bending, sort of eldritch entity, sort of, like, staring into the heart of madness type stuff. And yet there's all of this sort of, like, warmth and friendship and camaraderie and like sarcastic humor between the characters that and just kind of love and kindness that really gives it like this kind of warm, cozy feeling, which you wouldn't expect to say about a book like this, but I thought it was really enjoyable. So if you're into that kind of thing, especially I think if you've read The Willows and you really enjoyed it, I think this would be an interesting sort of companion piece. Obviously, they're not the same, but it's just interesting to see some of the sort of what she carried over and what she adapted and how she kind of made the story her own. So yeah, I definitely want to read more of T. Kingfisher's stuff, especially The Twisted Ones, and maybe I'll check out some of her fantasy as well. We'll see. But yeah, that was a really good suggestion from my friend, so I really, really appreciated that. So as I say, this year I've been trying to get through a lot more suggestions and recommendations and things. So glad to be, glad to have a good one. So yeah, that was everything that I've read so far. I hope you guys enjoyed. I don't know when I'll be back. It depends on how quickly I read and if I can find the motivation to make a video as usual. Again, I've been trying to get back into streaming, but it's just been hard to find the time and the motivation. But I do want to get back to it. I will eventually. But until then, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.